I'm delighted that Professor Dame Janet Finch is now here and sitting at the front. She does have some remarks, but she's going to start our afternoon session with her remarks. In the meantime, it's a great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Tim Blackman. He's going to share the next session with Professor Robert Dingle, and they are going to talk about some of the practical implications of the transition to Finch for individuals both within and outside of organizations. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Tim.
Okay, thank you very much. And thanks very much for the invitation to come along and speak to you today. What I'm really going to do is just take a look at the current situation from the perspective of the Open University, and I hope share some of our procedures and policy solutions and some of our dilemmas with you, and I'll be very interested to hear what's said in discussion. I'm also going to sort of rather unashamedly plug the OU in some of the initial opening slides for reasons that I hope will become clearer later on, so you can understand where we're coming from and why we think we can say something about this as a university that was set up with open access running through our bloodstream. Open University was established in 1969 as an open access university. We've delivered open access to education since then, opened our doors in 1971. Now have 250,000 registered students. We have no academic selection criteria for undergraduate courses. We also have a huge commitment to free learning materials. So on our Open Learn website, there are free learning resources, and we receive something like 6 million visitors a year to that website. We also, like everywhere else these days, have an open access repository for our research publications, Open Research Online, ORO. That has some 22,000 OU research publications freely available now. About 20% of the items in that repository have the full text of the publication with them, available immediately, and another 40% post-embargo. And I was looking at some figures on repositories. I was quite surprised to see that it's not unusual for full text content to be as low as 2% in some open access repositories. So we're an open access university, and, oops, slightly wrong order. We're multi-channel as well, and again, I want to leave some sort of think points about this at the end. Our aim is to take education to wherever people are, so we're on iTunes, we have our own podcasting site, we have our own YouTube channel. We also deliver to thousands of teachers and healthcare workers in Africa and Asia using mobile phones as the learning platform. Our virtual learning environments are widely recognized as state-of-the-art, our e-books too. And we're leaders in innovation. An OU student, for example, can use an astronomical telescope from their desktop computer or can use a microscope from their iPad. And we continue to innovate. Relevant to this agenda is our core project. This now enables searches from a single portal of open access repositories across the world. So if you go to our Open Research Online ORO site, you can also from there search a whole load of open access repositories across the world from that one portal. And we've built value-added services on top of that as well. So there's a recommender. It'll show you other related articles you may be interested in looking at. There's a whole set of repository analytics, so you can understand what's going on. And also a mobile app, so you can look at this from your mobile phone or from your iPad. We obviously work closely with the BBC as well. This is all open access. We co-produce some 25 TV and radio programs with the BBC, such as Frozen Planet, Van Gogh's The Theory, Coast, History of the World. And each year, around 1 million UK viewers follow links to the OU to get information about topics covered in the programme. So this is a very, very big commitment to open access. And we aim to do this without compromising quality. That's always been a priority for us. We're first-ranked university at the moment in the National Student Survey for overall student satisfaction. And we believe that access does not compromise quality. In fact, our belief is that access drives up standards. It helps to guarantee quality by making academia more transparent. So we're fully behind this agenda in principle. Our founders also were very conscious. I mean, the Open University faced fierce resistance from the higher education establishment when it was being set up at the end of the 1960s. And part of the answer to that was to write into our charter a commitment to research as well as teaching, so that we were a proper university from the start, despite our very unconventional approach to education. So although we're a non-selective university at undergraduate level, we do have an established research profile and a strong research profile in several areas, and we have some 1,200 research students as well. And also, I think, true to our radical position on lots of things, we also recognise, for example, that doctoral training is something that can be done outside universities, that there are suitable research environments for doctoral training in other organisations, and we have some 26 affiliated research centres that range from the Health Protection Agency to the Transport Research Laboratory that are Open University designated and approved centres for doctoral training. But for the OU, this open research agenda that we now have post the work of the Finch Group is a challenge. We've got some great examples at the OU of opening up public access to our research and particularly engaging the public themselves as researchers. Just a couple of quick examples. The Evolution Megalab is a site where we're involving thousands of members of the public in tracking the evolving markings of the banded snail. It's the biggest study of evolution in the world. The iSpot website enables the public to upload photographs of wildlife and get them identified through a kind of crowdsourcing mechanism, and in the process making new discoveries and promoting knowledge about how our environment's changing. But the new agenda of mandated open access publication and access to machine-readable data is a challenge for us, not least because of the cost. So while we're a large university, the largest in the UK, that's because our income is predominantly from teaching. And we have a model of teaching that scales up very well. It enables us to deliver high quality to large numbers of students at relatively low cost and even at no cost for some of our materials. But in research terms, we're mid-size. So the cost of open access, article by article and data set by data set, will be a challenge. And we're not one of the universities to receive some of the initial £10 million that's been made available to research to the most intensive research universities. So how are we addressing this? Well, we're committed at the OU to our open access repository. Whatever happens in this environment, we're going to continue with ORO as a critical part of the university's infrastructure. We will continue to invest in it and maintain it. But we also face the cost of implementing GOLD, open access publication. So for next year, 2013-14, the start of the RC UK mandate on GOLD, we'll receive, well, we've just been told we'll receive £77,000 from RC UK as the first of 5 years of block grant funding. But that falls quite considerably short of the cost of implementing the RC UK mandate. And the transition period in general, the transition period as in theory publishers change their business model from annual subscriptions to author payments, the transition worries us. Will we really see journal subscriptions decline substantially? We certainly hope to see that UK subscriptions, for example, already reflect UK policy. Why should we pay a higher subscription, as high a subscription in the UK as countries overseas when we've got this gold policy as well? And also, we've got this difficulty. I think some 90% of our journal resources at the Open University are non-UK. So we've got to work out how to implement this with all those complications. Our approach initially is likely to be that we will simply pay gold APCs, gold article processing charges, from a demand-led budget. So we won't set up complex rationing or eligibility criteria. This is our current thinking. But we will do that subject to a later review of affordability. And we, at the moment, really don't know how much that's going to cost us. We are really worried about the transaction costs of implementing gold publication charges, the cost of managing the whole thing, processing a whole load of invoices, and that will become even more expensive if we end up having to ration access to a publication budget. So OU costs in a little more detail. We've been doing some modelling recently. This graph shows the cost of gold publication at different rates, starting with the 45% mandate that RC UK is imposing from next year. And this is applying this to all of our publications. I mean, it's an interesting discussion point, actually. We're all focused on what RC UK is requiring of us, but what about other publications? Like many universities, a large part of the research time of academics at the Open University is funded from our own internal resources, not directly from RC UK grants. What's the position in terms of gold publication for those outputs? But working with 45% RC UK requirement next year, if applied to all our publications, would cost around 740,000, almost £750,000. At 100%, that goes up to over 1.6 million in estimated publication charges. Like many universities, we're trying to understand how to quantify this. So what we've done here in modelling this is simply to assume that the number of publications from different funders is in proportion to that funding as a total of our overall funding. So 17% at the moment of our total research funding is RC UK. We're assuming that that accounts for 17% of our publications in trying to work out these costs. Looking at this in more detail, here we've shown how RC UK publications specifically. So our RC UK block grant for gold, the £77,000 I mentioned, we estimate will pay for about 61% of the cost of the 45% mandate. So there's quite a gap there. We don't know where we're going to fill that gap from. In absolute terms, that unfunded amount increases as the RC UK mandate racks up year on year. So there's a funding gap here. And are we expected to meet that from student fees, for example? We'll need to make decisions about how we actually address that. Monographs, as have already been mentioned, are a major gap here. The arts and humanities particularly preoccupied with this. We're seeing some interesting developments in this area, like open book publishers, for example. And we're actively looking at this at the Open University at the moment, because we've just been, we've been quite successful with iBooks as textbooks on the Apple site, and also now on Amazon ebooks for all the major platforms. Some of those are free. Some of them are £4.99. We're now thinking of looking at publishing research monographs like this as well. We're probably going to run a pilot on that. And one of the reasons we're doing that is because ebooks are a tremendous way of just publishing research. They're so interactive. You can embed audio and video. You can make links to data. You can embed access to, for example, a microscope to check samples from the book. We are going to be looking at this, and we are going to be looking at whether we can make these freely available on the web as well. And I think part of the Finch Group agenda was to encourage this sort of innovation. And we're certainly looking at that. There's a whole set of outstanding issues, though, and you've already heard some of these. And, of course, we've got to get our heads around how to implement this. There's a basic awareness problem, our academics understanding what this is about, understanding things like funder rules on compliance, such as acceptable embargo periods. Costs I've mentioned are a concern, how we meet the funding gap that we have with regard to just the RC UK open access gold mandate. The cost of maintaining and storing data. And this is not just, SPSS data files, it's video, it's a whole range of types of data that's costly. We are helped, obviously, by having things like the ESRC data archive, but that doesn't cover the whole ground by any means. Cost versus benefit. I mean, it's interesting to reflect that the average citation rate of an academic article is less than 1. So the cost of doing this against the benefit is something interesting to reflect on. The open access data, we've certainly got concerns among some of our academics about IP, and the position in England seems to be that there isn't IP in research data. It's a different position to that taken in Scotland, where the Freedom of Information Act exempts research data. We have to get our head around how that will work. Ref open access, we're heading towards that. We'll be talking about that a bit later on. How's that going to work? Is it going to be open access at the point of ref submission or at the point of publication? How do we get those timelines right? The international dimension is a concern too. It looks like there's going to be patchy uptake of gold across the world. It's only going to be the richer countries that can afford to go down the gold route. Only some 6% of research publications have a UK author. How do we manage deployment of our publication fund at the Open University if 5 out of the 6 authors are overseas? Do we take into account that some of those are from Africa, but others are from rich countries? If we do have to ration funds, we are concerned about just the sheer transaction cost of doing that, of who gets what and when, in terms of paying gold charges. And we'll have to implement, as part of any procedure like that, appeals procedures and all the rest of it. So I wanted just to round off by actually saying, we're very preoccupied with the green and gold agenda at the moment, but there are other big things going on out there. There are other agendas, and some of these are being very actively promoted by some of my colleagues at the Open University. Here's the opening slides from Martin Weller's argument, which, if you're interested, you can go and have a look at on SlideShare. Are we actually preoccupied with this while other big things are about to break on the scene in higher education? The sheer transformative effect, not just of the internet, but of Web 2, and of going not just digital, but social as well. So while we're here talking about gold and green and so on, we may well be missing the huge disruptive innovation that's breaking across the globe at the moment and emerging fast from what definitely is a Web 2 moment in higher education. So at the OU, we're very much watching the MOOC agenda at the moment, massive online open courses, which are free courses being offered by some very good universities around the world with no credit, with no tutoring, although in a way the substitute for tutoring is social media among the students. And these are proving extremely popular. And this may come to nothing. It may be like the dot-com boom, or it may actually begin to break the traditional academic model. So are we actually, I wonder, distracting ourselves in this debate from something equivalent that's happening in terms of research practices? Are we going to see our research practices turned upside down by the force of the digital revolution across the world? To going digital, to going open, to going social. I'm very taken by the debate about sort of when do new centuries begin. You know, technically, the new century begins at 1801, 1901, 2001. But now, in the democratic age, in terms of attitude to knowledge, it starts at 0, because that's what the people think is sensible. And I think we are going to see a lot of academic arguments turned on their head by the sheer force of democratic engagement with traditional, conventional thinking in academia. And my final point is to say, are we actually going to start to see this whole agenda shift from a kind of Michelin guide approach to quality and reviewing, which is what we have at the moment, to TripAdvisor, where TripAdvisor is crowdsourcing what the value of things are through the social and global digital world, rather than taking academic authority as the way we manage quality. So I think there's some much, much bigger things going on out there, as well as our more immediate concerns with how we implement gold open access. Thank you.
I think I'm allowed to take over the chair at this stage, and I do apologise for having been over 2 hours late. Though why am I apologising for that, I don't know. Tim, that was really interesting. And what I think we should do is to have the second presentation in this session straight away, and then we can have questions. Is that okay, Stephen, to both participants for as long as we can run before lunch? So can I now introduce Professor Robert Dingle, who is a very important and active member of the Academy, and is speaking today as an independent researcher and citizen, he tells me.
Right, thank you very much. I don't know who else in the audience is feeling that their blood sugar is a bit low, and maybe I should just sort of leave out some of the more diplomatic phrasing that I've been working very hard at getting into this, just in order to keep it going for lunchtime. I want to begin by saying how much I really sympathise with Janet Finch's predicament in putting this working party and report together. We sometimes talk about the Minister of State as having two brains, and I sort of feel that having to chair this working party, Janet must have had to sort of develop a rather similar kind of syndrome that, on the one hand, there is sort of Janet Finch, the eminent sociologist, and we all know that one of the things that sociologists are very good at is pointing out the unintended consequences of otherwise apparently desirable actions. And on the other side of it, there's sort of Janet Finch, the ex-Vice-Chancellor, where one recognises the importance of sort of staying on side with the with the Department of Business, with the politicians. One sort of looks for the spaces that one can game the system in. That head-on confrontations with it are generally not terribly productive. And I think that kind of dualism sort of runs through a lot of this. Should the Finch report have stuck to the brief that it was given, or should it actually indicate some of the problems with the brief in the first place? And I think that this is something that we do need to we do need to keep in mind in this discussion, that all the evidence is that this is a decided policy. I was reading a piece from the British Academy that came out from their meeting a couple of weeks ago, and it was just distributed, I think, yesterday or the day before, which said, well, this is a starting point for negotiation. As far as I can see, it's not a starting point for negotiation. There might be a little bit of sort of give and take on how this actually gets implemented, but actually, there is a decision. Open access will come down the track. Britannia will sail majestically ahead of a sort of chugging flotilla of developed countries, all of whom will go down this pathway because this is historical inevitability. The phrase historical inevitability, of course, many of you will recall that perhaps the most celebrated sociologist of the last 50 years, Howard Kirk, in Malcolm Bradbury's History Man, who saw historical inevitability everywhere. And I would like to think that my discipline's learned a little bit since those days. But I still think that we get doomed to the fate of Cassandra, the Trojan prophetess who was doomed to make true prophecies that would never be believed. And I think we can very easily spend a day here, 2 days here, coming up with a set of true prophecies, which will have absolutely no impact on the world. The best we can hope for is, well, there's a reasonable prospect that this whole thing is a car crash. And the thing that we can do is to say 10 years down the track, well, we told you so. by which time, many of us will be retired, properly retired. One or two of us may have sort of gone up in a little puff of smoke somewhere. Some of the younger people in this room may actually have the responsibility of clearing up the mess. So one of the things that's very clear is that this whole policy was the subject of limited access with stakeholders, limited consultation with stakeholders, and I think Lynn's presentation made that very clear. Yet again, the social science and humanities community is being bounced into a policy particularly I think by the biomedical world. And that is a big issue for us, and I think it's about time that the social science community got its act together and tried to sort of push back on some of this stuff. I mean, we've had a succession of things, the models of ethical regulation, the whole kind of research integrity agenda, and now the open access agenda, which are devised, which are things which have profoundly social science implications, where there are social science evidence bases that are relevant to these policies, but where the social scientists never actually get brought in to the discussions and asked to make their evidence available. So you end up with these sort of evidence-light policies that simply run into a huge number of problems in practice. So when you have a kind of mandate on biomedical journals, I mean, one of the things that you need to remember is biomedical journals, they're a bit like yesterday's newspapers. Within 6 months, they're only good for wrapping chips with. The knowledge has got, the knowledge frontier moves on so fast that the stuff that by the time it gets into print, it's out of date, and it really is quite irrelevant. And that's why, for example, green open access isn't really a viable model in social sciences and humanities, because a lot of our stuff is slow burning. It's 5-year impacts. It's not 6-month impacts. It goes on having that value. Should also say that for the biomedical world, copyright is a very limited financial value compared with patents. I mean, it's very interesting. The community is not proposing to give its patent rights away. There's a handful of enthusiasts for kind of sort of openly sort of free dissemination of the results of biomedical work in the interests of humanity and suffering patients. Actually, most of the government imperatives, both here and in the United States, in the last 20 years, have all been, how can we lock down this IPR so universities can make money out of it? And nobody's proposing to give that away. So why aren't we challenging this more directly? Well, some part of it is the way in which all of these things accumulate with the move towards the managed university. And one of the things that does trouble me, as somebody who is no longer working in the system, is the power of the tool that this gives to vice-chancellors, or indeed to pro-vice-chancellors for research on their behalf, Tim, to secure compliant academics. So why am I criticising something which might seem to be of unquestionable benefit to independent scholars like me? As somebody working outside the academy, clearly there is something very appealing about the idea that I can just log on and I don't depend on, the goodwill of the institution for which I happen to be emeritus, which kind of gives me rather sort of flaky and unreliable access to their holdings, or the fairly limited tranche of materials that the post-92 university that I have an affiliation with happens to purchase, or the goodwill of a major publisher for whom I happen to be doing some work. But I think there are 3 concerns which make this perhaps less perverse. The first is the extent to which independents end up depending on charity. The second is the objection to the expropriation of my intellectual property rights. Thirdly, my concern as a citizen over the future of innovation. And I will toss in a 4th one because Lynn mentioned it earlier, and that's my concern about open access to data, where I have promised people confidentiality. I've just agreed with the Wellcome Trust archive, where I've deposited my data on a big child protection study which was carried out in the late 70s, that access to that will be closed for 100 years. And that is about the protection of children, the protection of informants. That is not something that under any circumstances I would want to see in the public domain. And that again, the Royal Society says nothing about this. There is no perception of these kinds of problems. And I think we've got to get markers in on that kind of thing. But fundamentally, open access for readers is restricted access for authors. And I think that's something that citizens should worry about. Not just us. It's not just a matter for us. It's a matter for the benefit of the community and for understanding what it is that drives innovation. So I'm going to say a little about each of these in turn in slightly more detail. So, who pays? People like me. Well, the Finch Report has nothing to say about the contribution of independent scholars, who might stand as a kind of proxy for everybody whose funding is a bit iffy or marginal. Graduate students, some postdocs, the various associates, casuals, emeriti, hangers-on, around the system, let alone the kind of citizen scholars that Tim was drawing our attention to. I'll just quote, what Finch does is to, and I'm sorry, this is the committee collectively, Janet, it merely expresses the pious hope that journals will be nice to them. All players in the research communications landscape will have to work together to establish policies and arrangements for dealing with publications by researchers with no institutional affiliation and no sources of funds from which to meet APCs. This is likely to be a particular issue in areas of the social sciences and humanities where the tradition of the independent scholar remains strong. And that's about it. Now, I have to say, one of my favourite authors is Adam Smith, and he has this great line in The Wealth of Nations. Nobody but a beggar chooses to depend chiefly upon the benevolence of his fellow citizens. One of the things that strikes me as somebody who is currently a journal editor is I don't want to have to sit there and ration access to my journal depending upon how many free entries I can afford to give people. At the moment, I just have to think about the scientific quality of the papers. I don't have to think about the about the author's ability to pay for the publication. And I don't have to make some trade-off between is the journal's revenue sufficient to support my editorial office and my contractual obligations through the publisher to the Learned Society who owns the title. I don't want to make those decisions about who's a charity case and who isn't, and I certainly don't want to be a charity case. And one of the virtues of the present ecology is my freedom to publish in any journal that suits me, that I think is appropriate for my work, and that I think is relevant to what I'm trying to communicate. So an inevitable consequence of the shift to open access, in my view, is a restriction on the range of voices that get into journals. That significant voices will be silenced. And I don't, for all the enthusiasm of some of our colleagues for social media, I think that the branding function of journals, the quality assurance function of journals, is going to continue to be very significant. I don't see that actually we're going to get, even in a sort of social media future, that we're going to get sort of like, dislike, and sort of Facebook type ticks as our criteria for quality assessment. The thing that we have as journals is, in the academic journal, is the branding, and that's the critical thing. And some people say, well, actually, it wouldn't be such a bad idea if we didn't have so many publications. Mostly, there's too much published. I can't keep up with it. There's an awful lot of rubbish published. People emphasize quantity over quality. I think the problem with that is, I sort of look people in the eye and say, okay, which of your papers would you be happy not to publish? Which of your papers would you be happy to sort of sit in the drawer or just decide I'm not going to write it? Because inevitably, and I take your comments, Tim, on a demand-led budget. I mean, no responsible university can indefinitely operate on that basis. I can see you can operate with a demand-led budget in the first instance to find out what the demand is. But it's inevitable that you're going to have to set a budget, and you're going to have to manage it, and you're going to have that rationing, and you're going to have to incur those transaction costs. And you may worry about the transaction costs, I worry about the rationing. And I worry about the fact that you ask the question, why would a university pay for any more than it needs to pay for to get to qualify for the next ref? That's the driver in the system. So I'll let you into something. I mean, in very nearly 40 years of an academic career, I've now published something like 107 articles. I didn't check with my CV because I just made this one up this morning. Now, in order to meet ref requirements, I would only have needed to publish 40. So that's potentially 67 articles that I got published that would never have seen the light of day under this kind of system. Yeah, maybe one or two of them, because perhaps some universities will be a little bit more flexible about, well, this one was not such a big hit for the ref, and maybe we'll give you money so you can have 5 in the period instead of 4, or assuming a sort of 4-year cycle. But who am I to say which are the 40 that should get published? Who is the institution to say that? More to the point, actually, some of the 40 that I think are best are not necessarily the ones in the best journals or the most cited journals. You kind of apply the metrics, and there's actually a very poor correlation between my estimate of the merit of the paper and what I thought its significance was at the time I wrote it, and what the market has told me. Now, one of the things about a system that is open to authors is the stuff goes out there, and the readers make their judgments. You haven't got these prior controls. You haven't got, you pass the quality threshold for the journal and it's out there. You haven't got to go through another layer of controls, another layer of regulation within the institution, which says, well, is this part of your professional development plan for the year? Is this part? How does this fit with our corporate research strategy? Do we want to pay for, do we want to pay for this to be in the sort of top US journal, or do we want to pay it in, put it in the sort of local village magazine? And those are the sorts of questions that will inevitably have to be asked, and the result is a diminution of the range of voices that get into the public forum. I used to think that government departments were generally in favour of sustaining property rights, unless there were proper legal processes for abrogating them or for appropriately compensating their owners. Now, the lawyers in the room may tell me this is a very naive view. But in general, and I mean, you can actually go back to reasons why ministers once upon a time used to resign because their departments made a mess of property rights. So some of you with the historical bent may remember the Critchell Down scandal in the 50s. And we do see still that with the Department of Business, Innovation and Science for their support for legal actions to prevent internet piracy in films and music and other creative works. And I find it really puzzling that in this instance, Biz is actually driving internet piracy. That actually, as a content creator, I find that my IPR is being confiscated by an arbitrary administrative action. Now, in theory, there might be some legal and constitutional remedies for this, but as any sociologist of law will tell you, there's a big difference between having a right and enforcing a right. And enforcing a right usually costs a load of money, and it generates a lot of goodwill, and it's something that you kind of don't really do lightly. I have to say, I also used to think of university librarians as very honourable men and women who went to great lengths to ensure that we all recognise intellectual property rights in content. I mean, I'm sure many of you can remember the forms that we had to fill in before we were allowed to Xerox anything. And to kind of create that trail of the rights so that the creator of a work could be properly recognised and rewarded. And now I find that actually librarians are cheerleaders for ripping off content creators. And I think it's a nice irony, though, that they're at last catching on that open access probably means job losses for librarians. Lynn was being very creative about suggesting, well, perhaps they could all sort of sidle into jobs in university research offices. I'm not quite sure about that. I mean, I think librarians might be a bit expensive for the research office. I mean, if I was going to be really facetious, and at this time of day, why not? I mean, I could suggest they could be redeployed to be baristas in the coffee shops that are increasingly invading university libraries, but that might be that might just be a dig too far. So the economic value of the content that I create is fairly small, but it's real, and particularly for those of us, for some individuals, inside and outside HEIs, it's likely to be quite significant. And paradoxically, of course, the more public impact that a social science and humanities scholar achieves, the more likely it is that their publications will have an economic value. So one of the things that's actually very much missing from the Finch Report is any calculation of the losses to authors, the economic losses to authors that will accrue as a result of open access. And that's something I think that authors are entitled to have thought about. In some ways, though, I'm more concerned about the lack of control that comes under the proposed CCBY licensing arrangements. Now, some of you, may glaze over a bit at this point, the minutiae of the Creative Commons licenses. But one of the things which has been drawn attention to already is the way that CCBY basically only says you can have your name stuck on things. Anybody who reuses your stuff must stick your name on. What it does mean is that any reuse can be reused in any kind of mashed up form, provided you have your name stuck on it. And for those of you who might have read my blog on the subject, they point out that this is actually really rather good news for neo-Nazis. That you can take a sort of sober academic study that says, actually, people who join extreme right organizations are really rather ordinary men and women who are finding a reasonable solution to everyday life problems, but, it's one that's a bit off the wall. And, if you're a member of that group and you want to you reuse the material in a recruiting pamphlet, you can have it out. Professor Dingle says we're just ordinary men and women with a reasonable, who are making a reasonable response to our circumstances. You've attributed it, as you're required to do under CCBY, but you've left out all the bit about, and here are the reasons why this response is a bit off the wall. Now, I'm sure that the creative minds in this room can rapidly come up with a bunch of other examples. And yes, we started a bit late, I think, Janet. I'm sure I can do that. I'd also like to comment on the wedge between scholarship and impact. I mean, if I'm a historian writing a major political biography, do I want to actually publish this as an open access monograph and give it away? Or do I want should I be entitled to enjoy the royalty income? So, academic publishing is a highly evolved ecosystem that's sustained innovation for over 350 years. OA is likely to promote the kind of Matthew effect identified by Robert Merton, to them that hath shall more be given. The voices that get into the public forum will tend to be restricted to established professional academics working in research-intensive universities. Anyone can read, but only a few can speak. Within organizations, there will inevitably be processes to ration the allocation of APC funds. One of the things that I would actually toss back to our biomedical friends is whether we would have the double helix if Watson and Crick hadn't been able to sort of get together in a coffee shop and a bar once or twice and do stuff that was completely outside their field, outside their discipline, outside anything that would have been in their work plan for the year. But I think that it's in the controls here. We point to the replacement of competition with central planning. That we end up with less diversity, less innovation, we entrench conservatism, and the result is stagnation. We make our work freely available, but we've got nothing worth reading. So I don't want to go on into sort of more general comments on the critique of the managed university, but I do think we need to acknowledge the way in which a degree of chaos, a degree of slack resources, these beautifully rational worlds don't necessarily facilitate innovation. So finally, what do I plan to do about it? Well, are there alternatives to open access? One of the things that we don't really understand enough about is who wants it, what they actually want, and whether there are better ways of meeting their needs. I direct a research program for a professional institution which deals with a lot of SMEs. And one of the things we've been looking at is knowledge management in those SMEs. What we discover is, entirely predictably to anybody who understands the innovation studies literature, most SMEs don't have what we would call the absorptive capacity. Because they're not involved in R&D themselves, they find it very hard to deal with research literature. So they pay knowledge intermediaries to scan it for them and to tell them what's relevant. And it's not at all clear to me that those knowledge intermediaries will lower their charges just because they get free access to the journals that they currently pay for. Indeed, their costs may shift around, but they may end up with higher search costs if the branding element of the journal is undermined. Personally, I don't know if this is a kind of sold pass already, but I would encourage learning societies to look very carefully at insisting on what is called the CCBY Ncmd license, which is, I understand, technically permissible under the Research Council's deal. I mean, I've had different advice on this, but NCMD basically says no commercial reuse, and ND is basically short for no mashups. You know, you have to use the whole thing, or you don't use it at all. What about me personally? Well, I think I'd probably end up not publishing in UK journals that expect me to pay me an author publication charge. And after listening to me for the last 20 minutes or so, you might think that's a very good idea. It might incline me towards giving up monographs, which are, as we've heard, quite hard to publish anyway. And I'm certainly looking very hard at whether I might want to do more self-publishing. As an editor of an American-based journal, I'd also say I'm really thrilled about the fact the British government's going to give me this handout. I mean, you know, we have a very low proportion of UK subscribers to this particular journal. We get a reasonable number of UK papers. We have so few UK subscribers, we're really under no pressure to lower our subscription rates. But you know, if every British wants to publish with me, wants to give me an extra $3,000 on my budget, I'm very cheerful about this. You know, I'm doing a good job for the society. So I'm sure that there is nothing here I'm saying that, you know, Janet won't have thought at some point as a, you know, this is sort of sociology 101, a lot of this stuff. It's hard to see open access as anything that's rather bad news for social science and humanities scholarship. I have this vision which probably owes rather a lot to Michael Moorcock's Dances at the End of Time sequence, you know, of, you know, sort of a handful of scholars in well-endowed universities write rather dumbed-down papers, you know, which kind of fill up the routine of their days, but where they don't really have anything very much to say. And those of us who work independently just disconnect from the system and vanish from the performance indicators.
Presentation. Tim, would you like to come back up to the front? And can I just take advice with, we still have to break at 1:15, Stephen? Yeah, okay. So we've got about 15 minutes for questions. I don't want to constrain questions at all, but just to remind you that there is a second day of this conference which is devoted wholly to learned societies. So although I don't want to prevent people asking questions about that, I hope that the questions today won't be too dominated by that and others will emerge. So who would like to begin? Okay, somebody over there.
My name's Emma Cass and I work at the British Library, so I'm going to have to brush up on my coffee making skills. I'm not very good at making coffee. My sort of question is to Robert, and it's basically about you're talking about the IP rights being lost if you publish in an open access type journal. Don't you think that happens already to a certain extent when you publish in a subscribed journal? Because obviously the copyright is held by the publisher.
Yeah, the copyright is held by, I mean, I'm happy to transfer the copyright to the publisher because the publisher is better placed to enforce it than I am. But certainly all the publishers that I have dealt with in many years, have seen it, there's been a clear understanding that any revenue arising from the publication or any request for reuse, the revenue would be shared and requests for reuse would reach me, would be run past me before anything happened to them. And certainly, as I say, that for me, although I think for others, the financial losses will be more substantial, for me it's fairly trivial. A few £100 a year at most. I mean, there's a principle at stake which I object to, which is having that stolen. But what I am much more concerned about is I'm rather jealous of the company that my work keeps when it gets out there. And I want to know what's happening to it. And if somebody wants to reprint it in a collection of some kind or a major work from a publisher or whatever, I want to know that that's happening. And I want the right to say no, that I don't actually approve of this reuse and that I'm not going to permit it.
Okay, another question.
Hello, Gail Burke from the International Relations side of things. I was just wondering whether, really it's another question for Robert. A lot of our research is covered by official secrets, so if we're going to have to provide the underlying data, how are we going to cover that? Is there an exclusion for official secrets? If our scholars are working for the UN, MOD, government, where are we going to get the data in the public domain in that event?
Well, I don't think that's a question to which I have seen discussed. And again, that says something about who's contributing to the debate.
Tim, do you have any comments on that?
It's a real dilemma. I mean, our current code of research practice at the OU does have a catch-22 in it in this respect. That on the one hand, we ask our researchers to make their data available so that their interpretations can be tested and validated by others, or invalidated. On the other hand, we say we will maintain and respect confidentiality. And it's really difficult. I mean, we're currently sort of taking some legal advice about whether a public interest clause would offer the trump card in terms of squaring that circle. But we haven't got an answer to it at the moment.
There was a question over there.
Yes, thank you. My name's Alistair Fitt. I'm PVC Research at Oxford Brookes University. And I wanted to ask Robert, don't you think you may have missed the point about biomedical journals? The point about most of the open access biomedical journals that have been established is that they are all author-pays journals. And so when I am one of these, you seem to regard as evil pro-vice-chancellors, I'm actually quite happy to give open access author pays money to somebody who publishes in there because I know that I'm not also paying a subscription for the journal. The whole problem comes, and the thing that really makes sort of my heart say yes to gold open access but my head say no, is that almost all of the journals outside those areas are hybrid journals. So if we pay open access, we're double dipped by the publishers. So the biomedical people are the people that are getting it right, not wrong.
Well, I think it's, again, you've got this question about whether this was the right path to go down for the social sciences and humanities. I don't know about other disciplines, but if you think of the top quartile journals in sociology, Jennifer, you might be able to corroborate me on this, but I would think of the top 25 journals on the ISI rankings, probably 20 of them are published from the US. There's only a handful of UK-originated journals in that ranking, and the British content supply contributed to those journals is really very small. If you take the AJS or the ASR, you're maybe talking about 1 or 2 papers a year at most. I think colleagues in management, if we've got anybody here, would say that it's the same is broadly true for them. Where you are dealing with leading international journals, the UK publications are a very small proportion of their content. And there is no economic or other reason for those journals to adjust their subscriptions to reflect that. So as I've said, editing a relatively low-ranking US-originating journal, what my subscription rate is determined by is what the US market will bear, and it's rolled out to the UK. And if UK authors come along, I'm very happy to publish their papers. And if they want to buy open access rights, I'm very happy to sell them. But I'm not going to be pressing the publisher to reduce the subscription rate to reflect that, because it's neither here nor there. And that, I think, is something that hasn't been properly appreciated by the people making this policy. We may contribute. We do only contribute 6% of the world's scientific papers, and that 6% does not give us a lot of leverage.
Tim, did you have any comments on that?
I think the difficulty is I'd be interested in your comments, actually, Janet, because it's this so-called sort of interim period where I think the Finch Group are expecting publishers to change their business models. I'm rather preoccupied at the moment on the fact we are going to have to pay twice for quite a while, and how we manage that. I think I'm right in saying that most universities in the UK carry out their research in deficit, their teaching in surplus. The students are paying for this at the end of the day. And because of more cost is being imposed on undertaking research, at least over this period of 4, 5, 6 years. But to tell you the truth, I just don't know where it's going to go, and it's a very pragmatic position we're likely to take at the OU of setting up a demand-led budget. And I take your point that we will need to watch what happens to that. But we're setting up a demand-led budget because we just don't know where this is going to go. And maybe it'll become a non-issue, maybe it'll become a huge affordability issue. We're not sure, but we're having to do it. But meanwhile, as the OU, we will be doing lots of other things as well. We will continue to invest in our open access repository. We will continue to be radical and outside the box regarding e-research and digital scholarship. And we will try to be disruptive as well. That's why I mentioned our possible experiment with e-research books.
I'm happy to make one or two comments about hybrid journals if you'd like me to. It's interesting that very recently the German equivalent of the RCUK, the DFG, has come out with a strong policy on open access, favouring gold open access, but saying that they will only pay for all gold open access and not for hybrids. You can obviously see why, because of the comments that have just been made. In our recommendations, we didn't take that view. Actually, and I think the needs of learned societies were very prominent in the reasons why we didn't take that view, because we believe that it's very important to manage this transition carefully and gradually, and that there will be some publishers, particularly learned society publishers, who will find that they want to manage the transition through the hybrid route, at least in the first instance. So we didn't make that recommendation, and because we didn't, we actually recognise that the cost of the transition is higher than it would be if you wanted to, throw it all up in the air and come straight down with gold, because there obviously is a period when you're paying some subscription costs and some open access author payment costs which mirror each other. But there are lots of people who still want to get in. I'll take 2 more questions so long as they're brief. So who would like to come next? There's several hands at the back. Yes. There's a small woman with dark hair in the middle, about 3 rows from the back. Yes, stick your hand up further. Yeah, can you go to her? Thanks.
While Stephen's getting there, let me just correct an impression. I'm certainly not saying that Pro Vice-Chancellors are evil. I'm saying that Pro Vice-Chancellors do a job. And, you know, indeed.
Okay, let's go to the next question. Right.
Thank you. Question for Tim. Harvard's taken the step of asserting a non-exclusive, non-derivative right to disseminate work published by any of its authors. Why can't UK universities do the same and make themselves compliant without paying extra costs? Sorry, my name is Meera Sabaratnam from the University of Cambridge.
Tim?
I need to think about that. What is it you're exactly expecting us to do?
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, sorry, yes. So Harvard has decided, it has itself issued an edict by which every employee working for Harvard, the research that they publish Harvard has itself a non-exclusive license to publish that on their institutional repository.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, our academic terms and conditions give copyright to the academic author, like I think most universities. And our code of practice mandates our academics to deposit bibliographic details and, if copyright allows, full text in our open access repository. So I think we're 70 or 80% there in that regard.
I think there is this very grey area about copyright. I mean, UK university contracts of employment vary quite a lot, but you know, in some cases it's very clear that copyright rests with the authors. In other cases, it's a bit fudged, and it's been one of those things where it's not really been quite in anybody's interest to clear it up. But I mean, it's not clear to me that a UK university would actually have the legal authority to make such a declaration. Now, again, I stand to be corrected by our legal colleagues.
Okay, let's take one more question before we break for lunch. Yes, down at the front here. Nope, here. Sorry.
Well done, Anne. Well done.
Stuck it out. Anne Buchanan, University of Oxford, also ESRC. Are there issues about research integrity? I think what worries me with this sort of move to open access, that actually some things will go on the repository really without the peer review, which has always been the quality standard. And in a world where Tim was saying that actually the readers will judge, some research can be very misleading and also dangerous. Particularly we've seen this with the impact agenda. And, you know, I think I worry about research integrity in the future.
Tim? For you, I think.
I mean, peer review isn't necessarily a guarantee of quality, of course, and I think we know that some very high proportion of certainly medical articles are shown to be wrong subsequently. But it's probably the best we've got. I think I would accept that. But I think there is a democratization going on because of the social nature of the web that may just sweep us along in this regard, whatever we think about academic authority, which is what we're claiming here.
I think the issue is that is one of the crucial things around the role of the learned societies, the role of the journal. That yes, we may very well see the kind of social media developments that Tim's talking about, and the kind of reader evaluations. Whether we necessarily want to accept those as a basis of public policy or scientific investment, is another question. And certainly when I was editor of a top decile journal earlier in the decade, I mean, I was always very clear that what we were selling was the quality assurance. It wasn't the physical product of the journal. It was the brand, and it was it was saying, and that I think remains true in a social media world. That that brands still have integrity, and that is the marker. And I have no doubt that Tim's right, that there will be this kind of proliferation of social media repositories, reader evaluations, whether we want, but the question will be whether those who have the responsibility for making policy, dispersing public funds, dispersing private funds on a large scale, will want to take those kinds of evaluations as authoritative.
Can I just make a quick additional point that in terms of the sort of user audiences for our work, and the reality is that somebody in a local authority or in the NHS, they don't actually go to Web of Knowledge, they go to Google. And then they make their own judgments about the plausibility and validity of what they find. And I think, the world is a very different place, and it's going to increasingly become so in terms of what the internet can do, and what Web 2 in particular can do in terms of people interacting with this knowledge. And, many academics now advise their students not to use Wikipedia, but, that's just absolutely crazy. Of course people use Wikipedia.
Yeah, but I think, Tim, that there is still the issue of, we try to train our students, to evaluate the source critically, and to look at the branding of the source, is important in that respect. And, it's important in many other respects. Our colleague from the PSA was quoting main panel C in the ref, and having been a ref panelist, if I'm asked to read 500 units of output in a 2-month period on top of my day job, I am looking for any signals I can get about what's the quality of what's put in front of me. And anything that will prevent me having to read every single word of those 500 units of output, I am very grateful for. And if I look and see that it's in something that I know to be a high status brand, that gives me a clue to the grading point that I'm going to be very grateful for and use very quickly. And fundamentally, I don't see that changing.
Well, I think we need to close the morning session there. If I could just say that in relation to the points that have just been discussed, which I think are extremely important, we gave the title to our report, Accessibility, Sustainability, Excellence. And those three are the three pillars that we believe that the whole future of scholarly publishing should be based on. And excellence is every bit as important as accessibility and sustainability. And we took the view that although people will disseminate material in a whole range of ways, it is essential that we keep a strong peer review system underpinning publications because of all the reasons that have been discussed about the authority that provides, which is even more important if you increase accessibility so that people who are not part of the research circle are actually making more use of research findings. So let us stop there. We start again at 2 o'clock? 2:05. Okay, we start again at 2:05. Thank you very much to all our speakers this morning and to all of you who've contributed. It's been very lively. Thank you very much indeed.